In the spring of 1921, a woman named Molly Kyle stood in the parlor of her family's home in Fairfax, Oklahoma, and watched her mother die. It was not a death that came gently, not a quiet passing in the night that might be expected for a woman of Lizzie Q. Kyle's age. Lizzie had been healthy, vigorous, even a full-blooded Osage matriarch who had watched her people rise from the depths of forced removal to become the wealthiest per capita population on Earth. She had survived the Trail of Tears, had built a life on the reservation that was supposed to be their final, permanent home. She had seen oil erupt from the Oklahoma soil, had watched the black gold transform her people from refugees into millionaires. And then, in the spring of 1921, she began to die. The doctors who came to examine her offered no explanation. They spoke vaguely of stomach troubles, of general decline. They nodded sympathetically at Molly and her sisters, murmured condolences, and took their leave. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was launched. Lizzie Kyle was simply pronounced dead, and the Osage community mourned another loss. But Molly, standing in that parlor, watched her mother's face in those final moments. She saw the pallor, the confusion, the way Lizzie's eyes seemed to search for something that wasn't there. She saw the same expression she had seen only months before, on the face of her sister Anna Brown. Anna had died in March of that same year, found in the hills with a single gunshot wound to the head. The local authorities had ruled it a suicide, despite the fact that Anna had been shot in the back of the skull at close range, despite the fact that she had been seen the day before at a party, laughing, full of plans, full of life. The coroner, a man who had been appointed to his position through the patronage of certain powerful white families in the county, had signed the death certificate without hesitation. Molly Kyle was not a fool. She knew what was happening in Osage County. Everyone knew. The Osage were being murdered for their oil rights, their head rights, their wealth. The system had been rigged from the beginning. The Osage Allotment Act of 1906, which had reserved the tribe's mineral rights, had also created a monstrous loophole. If an Osage LD died without a will, their head rights, those shares of the tribal oil wealth worth millions of dollars each, passed to their legal heirs. And their heirs could be anyone. White men. Lawyers. Businessmen. Guardians appointed by the courts to manage the affairs of Osage people deemed incompetent by a system that found full-blooded Osage to be inherently incompetent. The guardians were supposed to protect the Osage from exploitation. Instead, they became the exploiters. They skimmed money from their wards' accounts, invested it in their own businesses, and when the wards became inconvenient, when they asked too many questions, threatened lawsuits, refused to sign over their property, the guardians simply had them killed. It was a perfect system. The murders looked like accidents, or suicides, or the work of random violence. The local authorities were either complicit or indifferent. And the killers were almost never brought to justice. Molly knew all of this. She had grown up hearing the stories, watching her people live in fear. She had seen her family's wealth attract the attention of predators, had watched white men circle her like sharks. And she had married one of them. The year is 1921. The place is Osage County, Oklahoma. The wealth is oil. The crime is murder. And the victims are an entire people, ***. This is the story of the Osage murders, known in the history books as the Reign of Terror, a period from 1921 to 1926 when dozens of Osage tribal members were systematically murdered by white men who wanted their oil money. It was a conspiracy of such scope and brutality that it would eventually become the first major homicide investigation of the fledgling Federal Bureau of Investigation, and it would expose a network of corruption that reached to the highest levels of Oklahoma society. But this story is not just about the crimes. It is about Molly Kyle, a woman who watched her family die one by one, who knew the truth, and who fought back. It is about the investigation that finally brought the killers to justice. And it is about the legacy that remains, even today, a century later, a wound that has never fully healed. To understand what happened in those hills, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand the Osage, their history, their wealth, and how a system designed to help them became a system designed to destroy them. The Osage are a people of the plains, hunters and warriors who once roamed a vast territory stretching from what is now Missouri to Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. They called themselves Niukanska, meaning children of the middle waters. They were a powerful tribe, feared by their enemies and respected by their allies. But the coming of the Europeans changed everything. Forced to sign treaties, forced to cede their lands, the Osage were pushed west, farther and farther from their ancestral homelands. In the 1860s, after the Civil War, they were pressured once again to sell their reservation in Kansas. The proceeds from that sale were used to purchase a new reservation in what was then Indian Territory, the land that would later become Oklahoma. The Osage bought their new land. They paid for it with the money from the Kansas sale. And in the 1870s, they moved on to their new reservation, determined to make a life for themselves on the plains of what would become Osage County. And then, in the 1890s, oil was discovered. It was a discovery that would change everything. The oil under the Osage Reservation was abundant, vast, worth billions of dollars. But the Osage, having been cheated so many times before, were determined not to be cheated again. The tribal leaders who negotiated the Osage Allotment Act of 1906 were careful. They made sure that the mineral rights beneath the reservation would remain the property of the tribe. The surface land might be allotted, parceled out to individual families, but the oil, the coal, the natural gas, all of it would stay with the Osage people. It was a brilliant move. The Osage would control their own resources. They would benefit from the oil boom that was about to sweep across Oklahoma. And they would become, per capita, the wealthiest people in the world. But the government, predictably, found a way to subvert that control. In 1921, just as the oil boom was reaching its peak, Congress created a new system. Under the guardianship provisions of the Osage Allotment Act, white guardians were appointed by the courts to manage the funds of Osage Alades found to be incompetent. In practice, this usually meant full-blooded Osage. Mixed-blood Osage, who were more likely to have white relatives and white connections, were often deemed competent and allowed to manage their own affairs. The guardians had the power to approve or deny expenditures. They could invest the Osage's money, skim off the profits, and effectively control their wards' lives. And if a full-blooded Osage died without a will, their head rights, those shares of the oil wealth worth millions of dollars each, passed to their heirs. The stage was set for a massacre. And the man who would orchestrate the largest and most brutal series of murders was a rancher named William K. Hale. William K. Hale was the king of the Osage Hills. And he wanted a kingdom, ****. Hale was a cattleman, a businessman, and a man of immense ambition. He owned thousands of acres of land, controlled a network of businesses, and had cultivated relationships with the most powerful people in Oklahoma. He was the kind of man who could walk into a courtroom and have the judge call him by his first name. He was the kind of man who could have you killed, and no one would ever know. The Osage had suspected Hale for years. They knew he was behind the murders, knew he was trying to acquire their head rights. But they couldn't prove it. The local authorities were in his pocket, and the courts were reluctant to take on a man of his stature. In 1917, Hale's nephew, Ernest Burkhart, married a full-blooded Osage woman named Molly Kyle. It was a marriage of convenience, arranged by Hale and his associates. Molly was a wealthy woman, with multiple head rights inherited from her family. If she died without a will, her husband would inherit everything. And Hale, through his nephew, would control it all. The plan was simple. Kill Molly's family, one by one, until she was the only surviving heir. Then kill Molly, and the head rights would pass to Ernest. And Ernest, being Hale's puppet, would do whatever his uncle told him. The first to die was Anna Brown, Molly's sister. In March 1921, Anna was found dead in a ravine, a bullet wound in the back of her head. The coroner ruled it a suicide, despite the obvious impossibility. The second to die was Lizzie Kyle, Molly's mother. She died in the spring of 1921, under circumstances that suggested poisoning. No investigation was launched. The third to die was Molly's cousin, Henry Roan. He was found dead in his home, shot in the head. The local authorities ruled it a suicide, even though Roan had been killed while lying in bed, his hands folded across his chest, with no weapon found at the scene. The fourth to die were Molly's aunt and uncle, Rita and William Smith. They died in a bombing, their home destroyed in the night by a detonation that could be heard for miles. The local authorities ruled it an accident, a gas explosion. Molly watched her family die, one by one. She watched the coroners and the sheriffs and the judges turn a blind eye. She watched the white men who had been appointed as guardians circle like vultures. And she began to fear for her own life. She would be the last of her family. If she died, the head rights would pass to Ernest. And Ernest was Hale's creature. But Molly Kyle was not a woman to be easily defeated. She began to gather information, to document the deaths, to look for evidence that her family had been murdered. She began to suspect her own husband. She knew Ernest was involved with Hale, knew he was part of the conspiracy. And she began to fear that he might be planning to kill her, too. In the summer of 1922, Molly Kyle was confined to her bed with a mysterious illness. She had been having stomach trouble, weakness, dizziness. The doctors who came to examine her offered no explanation. They prescribed rest, fluids, simple remedies. But the illness continued to persist. Molly had a nurse, a white woman named Anna Kyle, who was tasked with caring for her. But Anna was one of Ernest's relatives, and Molly had begun to suspect that her care was something else entirely. One night, Molly overheard Anna whispering to Ernest in the hallway. The conversation was hushed, but Molly caught fragments. "The poison is working," Anna said. "Another few weeks, and she'll be gone." Molly was terrified. She knew she had to get away, had to get help. But she was weak, confined to her bed, unable to even walk. She was trapped in her own home, surrounded by people who wanted her dead. In desperation, she called her family doctor, a man named Dr. James W. McGrath. Dr. McGrath was a trusted friend of the Osage, a man who had cared for Molly's family for years. He arrived at the house, examined Molly, and immediately recognized the signs of poisoning. "You've been poisoned," he told her. "I have to get you out of here. You need to be in a hospital." Molly was taken to the hospital in Pawhuska, the county seat. She stayed there for weeks, recovering from the poison, regaining her strength. And while she was there, she began to plot her revenge. She would not let her family's murder go unpunished. She would find the truth, expose the conspiracy, bring the killers to justice. But she couldn't do it alone. The local authorities were corrupt, and the courts were reluctant to act. She needed federal help. She needed the Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau was not yet the FBI. It was a small agency, barely a decade old, with limited resources and a limited mandate. But it had jurisdiction over Native American reservations, and the Osage Reservation was, technically, under federal supervision. If the Bureau would investigate the murders, Molly thought, they might finally get to the truth. In March 1923, the Osage Tribal Council appealed to the U.S. government for help. The appeal was a direct result of Molly's efforts. She had been speaking to tribal leaders, telling them about the deaths, urging them to ask the federal government to step in. The tribal leaders listened. They had seen the same pattern of death, the same corruption, the same cover-up. They knew that the local authorities would never act. Only the federal government could bring the killers to justice. The Bureau of Investigation took the case, assigning a former Texas Ranger named Thomas White as the lead investigator. White was a tough, experienced lawman who had spent years chasing outlaws on the frontier. He knew the kind of men he was dealing with, and he knew they wouldn't be easy to catch. The investigation was hampered from the start by a lack of evidence. The witnesses who could testify were dead, or they had been intimidated into silence. The coroner's reports were fraudulent, the death certificates were incomplete, and the local authorities were uncooperative. White needed a breakthrough. He needed someone to talk. That someone was John Ramsey, a man who had been involved in the murder of Henry Roan. Ramsey had been one of Hale's associates, but he had fallen out with the king of the Osage Hills, and he was willing to cooperate with the feds. Ramsey told the Bureau everything. He described the conspiracy, the murders, the cover-up. He named names, pointed fingers, laid out the whole sordid story. And he implicated the most powerful man in Osage County, William K. Hale. The Bureau had its lead. But proving the case would be another matter. Hale was a formidable opponent, with money, power, and connections. He had bribed judges, intimidated witnesses, and created a network of corruption that reached to the state level. To bring him down, the Bureau would have to be clever. They would have to go undercover. The undercover operation in Osage County would become the most daring investigation in the Bureau's history. 3 agents, John Berger, Frank Smith, and John Wren, were dispatched to infiltrate the community, posing as wealthy businessmen, cattle buyers, and gamblers. They moved into the Osage Hills, embedded themselves in the local society, and began gathering intelligence. It was a dangerous assignment. The agents were in constant danger of being exposed, and the conspirators were not above murdering federal officers. They had already killed one honest man who had tried to stop them, and they would kill again if they had to. But the agents were good. They played their roles perfectly, becoming a part of the community, gaining the trust of both the conspirators and the victims. And they gathered a wealth of evidence, documents, witness statements, and the all-important confessions. The confessions came from Kelsey Morrison, a petty criminal who had been hired by Hale to murder Anna Brown. Morrison was a weak link, easily intimidated, and he was terrified of the federal agents. He agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Morrison told the agents everything. He described the murder of Anna Brown, the shooting, the cover-up. He implicated Hale and Ernest Burkhart in the killings of Rita and William Smith. He laid out the entire conspiracy in meticulous detail. The Bureau had its case. But there was a catch. The evidence was tainted. Morrison was a known criminal, and his testimony might not be credible. The bodies of the victims had been cremated or buried, and no physical evidence remained. The local authorities were hostile, and the juries were likely to be sympathetic to the conspirators. The prosecution would have to be careful. They would have to build a case that was airtight, that couldn't be challenged. And they would have to bring the trial in a court that wasn't corrupted. The solution was to federalize the case. The murders of Osage tribal members were federal crimes, under the Bureau's jurisdiction. The prosecution would be in federal court, before a federal judge, and the jury would be drawn from a larger pool. The trial of William K. Hale, Ernest Burkhart, and John Ramsey began in 1926. It was a spectacle, a media circus, the biggest trial in Oklahoma history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers. The defendants sat in the dock, looking smug and confident, while the prosecution laid out its case. The evidence was overwhelming. Confessions, witness testimony, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence painted a picture of cold-blooded murder, orchestrated by the king of the Osage Hills. The verdict was guilty. But the battle was not over. Hale's lawyers appealed, citing technicalities, and the conviction was overturned. A new trial was ordered, and Hale seemed to be laughing at the feds. The second trial, in 1929, was a rerun of the first. The evidence was presented again, the witnesses testified again, and the jury found Hale guilty again. This time, the conviction stuck. William K. Hale was sentenced to life in prison. Ernest Burkhart, who had pleaded guilty, was sentenced to life. John Ramsey was also sentenced to life. The king of the Osage Hills had fallen. But justice, as the Osage knew, was a slippery thing. Hale was released from prison in 1947, after serving only 18 years. He had been paroled, despite the protests of the Osage people, despite the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. He returned to Osage County, to his ranch, to the life he had always known. Ernest Burkhart was released in 1937, after serving 11 years. He lived out his life in obscurity, a broken old man who had been used by his uncle. The murders, however, had taken a toll. The Osage had been decimated by the Reign of Terror, and the community was never the same. The wealth that had once flowed through their veins had been stolen, squandered, and the tribe was plunged into poverty and despair. But the memory of the murders remained. It lingered in the hills, in the stories, in the songs. It remained in the faces of the descendants, who still carry the burden of that injustice. And it remains in the question that haunts Osage County to this day: were there others? The official record says that between 1921 and 1926, over 60 Osage were murdered. But the real number is almost certainly higher. Many deaths were never reported, never investigated, never prosecuted. The coroners were in the pay of the conspirators, and the death certificates were often fraudulent. The murders continued, even after the trials. The thirst for oil money, for head rights, for wealth, was too great. The conspiracy didn't end with Hale. It was embedded in the system, in the culture, in the corruption that had come to define Osage County. The Osage, meanwhile, continued to fight. They fought in the courts, in the legislature, in the newspapers. They demanded justice, demanded accountability, demanded that the system that had been rigged against them be reformed. And they fought for their identity. The Reign of Terror had tried to destroy them, tried to take their land, their wealth, their lives. But it couldn't take their spirit. In the end, the Reign of Terror was not just about murder. It was about greed, about power, about the corruption of justice. And it was about the endurance of a people who refused to be defeated. Molly Kyle survived the poison. She lived to see the trial, the conviction, the fall of the king of the Osage Hills. She lived to see the Bureau of Investigation become the FBI, its reputation burnished by the successful prosecution of the case. But she also lived with the ghosts. She lived with the memory of her family, murdered one by one. She lived with the knowledge that her own husband, Ernest, had been part of the conspiracy. She lived with the weight of that betrayal, that loss, that grief. And she lived with the question that still haunts Osage County today: can justice ever be truly done? The Osage murders were a crime against humanity, a genocide by greed. They were a reminder of the dark side of the American dream, the willingness of some to kill, cheat, and steal to achieve their ends. And they were a testament to the resilience of the Osage people, who refused to be broken by the violence, who fought back with courage, with determination, and with the power of the truth. The truth, in the end, is all we have. The truth about what happened in those hills, about the murders, the cover-up, the lies. The truth about the Osage, their wealth, their suffering, their endurance. And the truth about the question that remains: what if it had been different? What if the authorities had acted sooner? What if the courts had been honest? What if the system hadn't been rigged? We will never know. The dead cannot speak, and the truth is buried with them. But we can honor their memory. We can tell their story. We can make sure that their suffering is not forgotten, and that the Reign of Terror is never repeated. The Osage Hills are quiet now. The towns are sleepy, the oil wells are silent, and the graves of the murdered have long since been reclaimed by the prairie. But in the hills, in the wind, in the stories that are still told around the campfires, the ghosts of the dead linger. They are the ghosts of Anna Brown, Lizzie Kyle, Henry Roan, and all the others who were killed for their wealth, their land, their head rights. They are the ghosts of Molly Kyle, who survived to tell their story, who fought for justice, who refused to give up. And they are the ghosts of the Osage people, who were nearly destroyed by greed and violence, but who survived to tell their own story. The truth is this: the Reign of Terror was not a natural disaster, nor an accident of history. It was the result of a deliberate, systematic conspiracy of murder and corruption, and it was facilitated by the government that was supposed to protect the Osage. The legacy of that violence is still visible today, in the wounds that haven't healed, in the divisions that haven't been bridged, in the poverty that still plagues the Osage Nation. But there is hope. There is the resilience of a people who have survived everything, from the Trail of Tears to the Reign of Terror, and who continue to thrive. There is the determination of the Osage Nation to preserve their culture, their language, their identity. And there is the truth, which is finally being told. The books have been written, the movies have been made, and the story of the Osage murders is no longer forgotten. It is a story of greed and corruption, of violence and betrayal, of a people who were nearly destroyed by the wealth that was supposed to be their salvation. But it is also a story of courage, of endurance, and of the power of the truth to prevail, even in the darkest of times. The last question remains, unanswered, haunting. In the Osage Hills, Where the wind whispers through the prairie grass and the ghosts of the murdered walk unseen, can we ever truly say justice was done? In the spring of 1921, Molly Kyle stood in the parlor of her mother's home and watched her die. She knew the truth. And she told the world, ***. The truth, in the end, is all we have. The truth about the Osage murders, the reign of terror, the conspiracy of greed and corruption that destroyed a people. And the truth about the question that still haunts Osage County, the question that cannot be answered, the question that lingers in the hills like the wind, like the ghosts, like the memory of the dead. What if justice had been different? What if the system hadn't been rigged? What if the Bureau had investigated sooner, the courts had been honest, the authorities had acted? What if, in the end, justice had been done? We will never know. But we can remember. We can honor. We can tell the story. And we can hope that, one day, the ghosts of the Osage Hills will find their peace.